Right now on theGrio, a beautiful island with a dark history. Puerto Rico marks well over a century as a U.S. colony. The push to change and give the territory independence. And some say it's colonization all over again. While more mainland Americans are moving to Puerto Rico and displacing the native populations. And what does it mean to be black in Puerto Rico or around the diaspora? We'll talk about the history to push and erase blackness off the island. A special hour of theGrio with Marc Lamont Hill starts now. Good evening and thanks for joining me tonight on theGrio. I am your host, Marc Lamont Hill. Puerto Rico recently marked a major anniversary, an unfortunate one. This year marks 125 years of the island being a colony of the United States. So how did we get here? Back in 1898, the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico as part of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. took the island as a prize. So after 400 years of being a colony of Spain, Puerto Rico had a new owner. It was expected at the time that the U.S. would either give Puerto Rico independence or make it a state. Instead, the U.S. ruled Puerto Rico directly through an appointed governor. Puerto Ricans weren't allowed to elect their own governor until 1952. Puerto Rico is now technically a commonwealth and should have more self-rule, but the island still has no voting representative in Congress, allowing lawmakers to vote on rights and on benefits without giving Puerto Ricans a say in the decision-making process. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled that Puerto Rico has no real political sovereignty. The next year, Congress responded to Puerto Rico's debt crisis by establishing a fiscal control board with the power to set the Commonwealth's budget and overturn Puerto Rican laws. Early in July, that federal control board approved a nearly $13 billion budget. It contains pay increases for teachers and court employees, as well as money for public safety. If Puerto Rican officials can present a balanced budget next year, that should mark the end of the federal control board. But the board says it's too early to tell when its role will end. Puerto Rico's economic benefits are slow coming. The federal government approved money to rebuild a key dam in Puerto Rico. The Oaxaca Dam was damaged during Hurricane Maria back in 2017. Temporary repairs were made then, but only now will permanent work be done. The dam provides water for crops. It offers potable water for more than 300,000 people, and the project is expected to take a full decade. All right, so I've laid out a little bit of foundation, but there's some people here who are a lot smarter and more interesting than me to help break it all down. I got two amazing guests. The first is community organizer and activist Rosa Clemente. She's in the building with us, along with Danielle, Clealand, a political scientist and an associate professor of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas. She's also the author of The Power of Race in Cuba: Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution. I want to thank you both for joining me for this entire hour. Rosa, I'm going to start with you. And I want to mention, by the way, you ran on the ticket for the Green Party. You ran for president. You were on the vice presidential side of the ticket. And I believe you were the first Puerto Rican to run for national presidential office, vice presidential office. Is that right?
Yes, but also, like, my proudest thing is to say I'm the first Black Puerto Rican hip hop activist to run for vice president of the United States with Cynthia
I like
McKinney. That. Yeah. And, it's been 15 years. July 12th this year, or July 12th that just passed, was 15 years since me and Cynthia got the nomination in Chicago.
Wow. Well, we don't want to forget that, because I think your political connection in some ways speaks to some of the political goals that people have on the island and also here regarding Puerto Rico. So let's get started with it. A lot of people, Rosa, when they think about Puerto Rico from the United States perspective, don't appreciate that history. They don't understand how the U.S. came to control the island or what that means for people on the ground.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for saying Puerto Rico, even though that name was imposed on us, which literally meant port of riches. But I think we have to look at the larger, global history past 400 or 500 years. So Puerto Rico was invaded, by Christopher Columbus. The indigenous population completely decimated for almost 300 years under Spanish colonial rule. But in the mid 1800s, we begin to see, right, like Caribbean nations standing up and ending African enslavement, the African trade. But in Puerto Rico, we also see some of the first slave rebellions, and I think it's important for people to understand that as the Spanish colonial empire was dying, they were actually paying Spaniards to go to lighten the race, because at that time, after so much of the decimation of the Taino indigenous population, 64% of the people in Puerto Rico were African and African enslaved people. So the Spanish crown was sending Spaniards. And then at the same time, we begin to see Ramon Betances linking up with other Caribbean leaders and trying to yoke off British control and Spanish control. And one thing that's important to know is that what was supposed to happen was Puerto Rico and Cuba were going to be free. That's why our flags look exactly alike, right? Cuba became free, and within less than a year of Spanish colonialism being brought down, the United States then invades Puerto Rico. And the reason they invaded it was they wanted to have some type of command and military presence in the Caribbean. So,
and see, that for me is that's an interesting analysis, an important analysis. Let me bring Danielle in. Danielle, I mean, this is part of, I think, what's a challenge for me, right? When I hear the story of Puerto Rico, I see a story of indigenous people. I hear a story of black and brown people. I hear a story of European control, domination, and violence. It sounded real familiar. I mean, it feels very similar to what I'm hearing in Cuba. As Rosa said, it's very similar to what I'm hearing in the United States. I could go all around Africa and the Middle East. These stories of these places seem awfully similar.
Sure. I mean, they are. And, what was happening, as Rosa mentioned, is that, the United States essentially has taken a role at this point, right, in the very late 1800s, to try to dominate the entire region. And so they took different strategies in different countries. So in Cuba, they actually assisted the army to help defeat the Spanish. And then, although Cuba became free at that point, they still were able to take over and calling Cuba a protectorate, right, where they had the right still to interfere in politics, to interfere in the economy. That's when they established Guantanamo. In the Dominican Republic, there was a long history of U.S. occupation when they felt that, politics was not going their way, right? So anytime that U.S. interests were threatened, they were, there to interfere in whatever way, either militarily, politically, economically. And so Puerto Rico stands as the kind of exception in that, no, they were not independent. And so they suffered, right, the most control out of all of these Spanish-speaking Caribbean countries, in that, the U.S. took control. But these are all, yes, the same kinds of stories of slavery, right, and colonialism and imperialism. The difference is that, once the United States comes into play, then they become, the main aggressors as far as, imperialism and economic dominance is concerned.
So that's an important point, and we're going to take a break in a second and come back to talk more about this, but I want my audience to really understand why this is so important, especially for black people. First of all, so many of the divisions that we make are artificial ones. So many of the people who are catching hell in Puerto Rico, are catching hell in Cuba, are catching hell in DR, they're catching hell because of Europe. They're catching hell because of what was done to us, and then we're all enslaved and dropped off in different places and taught to turn on each other rather than turn to each other for solidarity. Because if we had solidarity, we'd be able to struggle and fight and regain control of our native lands. We'd be able to produce our own methods of liberation and not wait for other people to save us or to incorporate us into their so-called democracies. That's why the story of Puerto Rico is so important. And as we commemorate that 125 years since the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico, we're using this tonight as an opportunity to talk about those histories, to talk about our roots, and to talk about how black Blackness and Africanness is completely bound up on that island of Puerto Rico and in all the other places around the world that were implicated in slavery and other forms of imperialism. So we're going to tell the story tonight, and we're going to figure out how we can get free, how we can make sure Puerto Rico is free, and how we can make sure the black folk around the world are free, and how we can all do it in one big global community. So everybody stay right here. Rosa and Danielle are going to come back with me. And when we come back on the other side, we're going to talk about this renewed push to give Puerto Ricans more say in their fate. We're going to talk about the move toward independence or statehood. Do you want to be your own country, or do you want to be the 51st state? We'll answer that on the other side. Welcome back to theGrio. The current meeting of Congress included a renewed push to allow Puerto Ricans the right to decide their status. If approved, the Puerto Rico Status Act would allow Puerto Ricans to vote among three options: independence, sovereignty and free association with the United States, or statehood. A similar measure passed the House last year, but the Senate never took a vote. Surprise. The measure was introduced this spring and is currently in committee. Now, this comes as Puerto Rico sees an increasing amount of gentrification. As the territory works to get out of bankruptcy, officials created tax incentives for people who move there to buy property. That has inflated home prices, displacing people who can no longer afford to live in their hometowns. Many of the new wealthy residents are cryptocurrency traders, which has now created a new problem. Puerto Rico's Secretary of Economic Development and Commerce says he's working with the IRS, which is investigating about 100 high-income people who are suspected of abusing the incentive program to dodge federal taxes. The rich always find a way to get richer, y'all. We're going to be talking about that with Danielle Clealand. She's a political scientist. She's an associate professor at the University of Texas. She's also the author of The Power of Race in Cuba. I'm also joined by Rosa Clemente, Black Puerto Rican hip-hop activist, community organizer, and former vice presidential candidate nominee of the Green Party. Thank y'all for joining me today. Help me understand this struggle for independence. There's an idea here, when I was growing up anyway, that Puerto Rico should be fighting to become the 51st state, and that's how they'll get protection, that's how they'll get treated right. Other people said, nah, we don't want to be under the thumb of the U.S. Then other people said we need some kind of complicated relationship because the U.S. has done so much against us that we need support. We need some kind of investment from the U.S., but we also want our own sovereignty, our own freedom. And so figuring out what that looks like can be challenging. Danielle, I'm going to start with you, especially because there's been such a long history of nations trying to figure out, or of peoples, communities, nations, whatever, trying to figure out what freedom looks like. For Puerto Rico, what's at stake here?
I mean, I think a lot of the times, when we're thinking about status, right, we're thinking about economic power, we're thinking about economic stability. And, when we were talking in the last segment about independence, Haiti was the first Black republic. They were the first ones to overthrow slavery, to overthrow colonialism. And as a result, they were ostracized, right, by Europe, by the United States, by the entire world. And so I think that, we can kind of take what happened with Haiti and really think about, some of the fears around status in Puerto Rico. And so, there, as you said, are folks in Puerto Rico that want to, be a state, right, the 51st state. There are folks that don't necessarily want to give up all of the sovereignty, but then also don't want to be independent, right, and remain in this kind of limbo, which some call a commonwealth, I call a colony. And then there are others that want to be independent. But the independence movement has historically been very small. The last election, they gained more of the vote than usual, about 13%, but usually it's about 3 to 4% of the population.
That is
that's voting.
Interesting to me. Hold on. This is fascinating to me, particularly given this history.
I challenge that. Look.
Jump on in, Rosa.
Sorry. Yeah. So first, look. Puerto Rico geopolitically does not fit into Latin America or the rest of the Caribbean. Why? Because we were forced, and United States citizenship was imposed on us in 1917 so that the United States military could recruit more United States citizens to fight World War I. So our relationship is the strongest with particularly the African American community, right? These United States citizens that are not treated as first or second class citizens, in Puerto Rico, not even as third. we can't vote for, if you live in Puerto Rico, you cannot vote for the president of the United States. With all that being said, the independence movement was not small. What happened was the terror inflicted via the United States military and government sought to literally squash and assassinate our independence movement. And they did that most prominently with the independence leader, Pedro Albizu Campos, right? So what people don't understand is that the United States, at the end, kidnapped Pedro Albizu Campos, tried him, threw him in a penitentiary in Atlanta, put in a cancer-causing light, and basically killed him. And the reason they did that was because the independence movement was growing. And in fact, in the mid 1920, maybe 27, 28, the Ponce massacre happened. And the Ponce massacre, my grandmother's from Ponce and my mom was born there. The Ponce massacre was when on Easter Sunday, as particularly the women were coming out of church, the United States military massacred over 120 Puerto Ricans. And part of it was after that church event, the abuelas who were packing were about to start a revolution. So,
oh wow. Well, hold on. Let me pause you. Just I want to have some clarity here, and then I want to give Danielle a chance to respond. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that are you? Okay, real quick.
This part is important because Danielle brought that up, which I'm glad she did. So the voting aspect, right? They're called plebiscites. We've had over 11 of them. The last two plebiscites, independistas and those that don't want statehood purposely did not vote in the plebiscite because we're tired of this performance that has been happening now since 1952. These plebiscites, even AOC, I told her, I said, you don't need to introduce anything in Congress. All you need to be talking about is that Puerto Ricans don't want statehood. I don't care what anybody says. Most Puerto Ricans don't want it, and it's never going to happen. Whatever the fantasy is that we're going to be the 51st state will never happen. And AOC and other congressional Puerto Rican leaders have been wrong on this from the beginning. They
All right, Rosa, I gotta bring Danielle back in. I gotta let Danielle get back in before we go to break. Danielle, Danielle, go ahead.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what was said, right? The history of the Independence Party is much different than what it looks like, right, when we're voting today. And so, yes, the U.S. crushed the independence movement. The U.S. crushed, their leader, Pedro Albizu Campos. And so what we're left with today is a very small percentage of folks that are voting for the Independence Party when they're voting for governor. The plebiscite is something. Voting. I think the plebiscite is.
No, Rosa, let her finish.
I'm just saying that, look, as a Boricua, let me just...
Rosa, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, but I want to...
I'm sorry.
So we're almost up against the break. So, Danielle, I'll let you finish that first thought, and then we'll come back on the other side and let you finish your thought.
Yeah. No, the plebiscite is largely, I think, a waste of time. But when I'm thinking about, when I say voting, I'm talking about voting for a governor, right? Voting for, certain parties in the actual elections. And so in that sense, those that are supporting independence movement is small. That may not mean that the folks that would like independence is small, right? But the folks that are actually voting in these elections end up being a very small percentage of the vote. And so I think it's worthwhile to kind of, think about what it is that makes, the independentistas, right, or those that are for independence, not able to kind of, get a majority behind, that particular party.
That's an important distinction to make, too, between people who might want independence and people who are actually voting independent. And when you all come back, I'd love to get some insight into why there's a gap there between what people want and what they're voting for politically and why they think that's a worthwhile strategy. Rosa, Danielle, we're going to take a quick break, come back. I got a couple questions for y'all. Then we're going to get deeper into the depths of Puerto Rican politics, but also African ancestry. We're going to talk about the fact that most Puerto Ricans have African ancestry. So what does it mean to really be Afro-Boricua? Welcome back to theGrio. We are back with Danielle Clealand. She's the author of The Power of Race in Cuba, Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution. All right, I ain't got but a minute, but I have a question for you. I want to raise the name of an Afro-Latino, really Afro-Boricua hero? Is there somebody out there who you would regard as a hero of yours? And the reason I'm doing it is I want the audience to know the names of some really important figures in the history.
Yeah, so, I mean, we talked a little bit about Pedro Albizu Campos, who was very important, a national hero for the independence movement. But I want to also talk about Roberto Clemente, because he was a baseball player, played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, starting in the 1950s. And I wanted to talk about him particularly because I think, you know, when we're talking about the history, right, of Black folks sounding the same, right, whether you were in the DR or in Cuba or in Puerto Rico or in the United States, a lot of our histories are very much the same. And so Clemente got here, and he, you know, he was an all-star, he was an MVP, he was an exceptional player, but he was playing in the late 1950s, early 1960s, in the middle of Jim Crow. And so he was somebody that was vocal about the issues of racism. He was somebody that was vocal about the problems that he experienced as a Black and a Latino player, right? Saying that he had two strikes against him.
We're going to, we got to take a break, but everybody please know Roberto Clemente was a hero, one of the greatest baseball players we've ever seen in the sport. And by the way, just like so many other Black folk, in the midst of all that, he still joined the Marines and enlisted during the offseason. Next up on theGrio, the last census revealed surprising numbers of the number of Puerto Ricans who identify as Black. Thanks for staying with us tonight on theGrio. I am your host, Marc Lamont Hill. The 2020 Super Bowl halftime show was major for the Latino community. Jennifer Lopez, Shakira, they were headlining. You had Bad Bunny, you had J Balvin making appearances. But one thing was noticeably absent. Before the game, Shakira and J-Lo promised the performance would be all about unity and Latino pride. But that pride didn't seem to include any Afro-Latino people. The performance included a song by Cardi B, but Cardi wasn't on the stage. The show was done in Miami, yet there was no Black Miami-born performer. There was no, for example, Amara La Negra. There wasn't even anyway, none of them. After the performance, Shakira took to Instagram to thank the Afro-Caribbean rhythms that allowed her to create the show. It's such an interesting dichotomy, but we see it all the time. Anyway, Black erasure is real. It's estimated that 60% of Puerto Ricans have significant Black ancestry, yet only 17% of Puerto Ricans identified as Black in the last census. Let me bring my crew back in. I got Rosa Clemente. She is an amazing I won't say politician. She's a political activist who ran on the VP ticket of the Green Party. She's also a community organizer and a brilliant person. And the equally brilliant Danielle Clealand is here. She's a political scientist, and she's a professor at the University of Texas and the author of a book that y'all should read. It's called The Power of Race in Cuba, Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution. Danielle, let me go back to you for a second here. First, I want to talk about this question of identity, particularly since you wrote a book on racial ideology in Cuba, but similar questions sometimes come up, which is if people have so much ancestry, right? If you're a Puerto Rican who isn't just rooted in Spain, but you're rooted in a Taino ancestry, you're rooted in an African ancestry, why do the people run from the indigenous stuff? Why do people run from the Black stuff, the African stuff so much?
I mean, I think there's a narrative that suggests that, you know, Black Latinos don't want to be Black. I think that narrative is false. You know, when there's a lot of nuance. You know, I'm not going to deny that there are, you know, Black Puerto Ricans that, you know, don't want to identify as Black, you know, but are. But I also want to say that there are a lot, right, that are proud to be Black, that talk about the issues of Blackness, that talk about the issues of racism, that are, you know, well-grounded in their Blackness. And so I think that, you know, we have to kind of tell the entire story. A lot of, you know, the issue that I write about in my book, but that also exists in Puerto Rico, is that, you know, race and Blackness was something that was erased by the state. It was attempted, you know, to be talked about in a way that suggested racism didn't exist. You know, while we were over here in the US, you know, with formal segregation and Jim Crow, right, and a Black movement and a Black is beautiful kind of movement, in Puerto Rico, what the state was trying to push was that we are all equal, right? To try to not plant the seeds for the kinds of movements that we saw here and in other places. And so, in that sense, they created this narrative of racial harmony, right? To suggest that, Black folks didn't need to, organize because, racism wasn't an issue. For some people it worked, for some it didn't, right? I mean, I was on the ground doing a survey in Puerto Rico, and most Black folks recognized the presence of racism. But I think that, the narrative has been damaging throughout Latin America.
Did those people, Danielle, self-identify as Black, though? You say you talk to Black people, and I ask this because I've spent a decent amount of time on the island, and when I go, I remember when I initially used to go, I'd see people on the bus, I'd see people on the street, and I didn't read them as Puerto Rican. I thought they were Black tourists like me, and I walk up to them, and, I realized it took me a minute to figure it out, and when that happened, I didn't know what their self-identification was. And I have the same issue in the Middle East. People who look like me often don't identify with the Black piece of it. So I understand that they recognize the racism, but do they see that as a function, an extension of their personal Blackness? Do they individually see themselves as Black?
Yes. I mean, from what I've seen, yes. I think that the census is complicated, right? Because the census is using U.S. categories. And so that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. When we're, because Puerto Rico was a colony, they're using the U.S. Census. And so they're using these categories: white, right, Black, African American, Native American. And so what happens is a lot of folks don't necessarily know where to identify. There's been some important activism on the ground that has pushed for Black folks to identify as Black. And you've seen an uptick from the 2000 census up until the 2020. And I also want to point out that, Puerto Rico did not include race in the census from 1950 until 2000. And so that's all part of this kind of narrative that says that race doesn't matter. But there has been a lot of activism.
Let me bring Rosa into this for a second, because there's a complexity here. I want to bring Rosa in for a second. There's a complexity here in multiple ways, right? On the one hand, there's the question of our Blackness. And by our, I mean just people around the globe. And then there's this question of race, and sort of what race means from one area to another is different. How you get racialized in America is different than how you get racialized in Cuba. It's different how you get racialized in South Africa. Different how you get racialized in Jerusalem. It's all different. So, Rosa, how do you see, or how are you thinking about this idea of race and Blackness in Puerto Rico, particularly for you as somebody who identifies as a Black Puerto Rican?
Well, look, until 1993, no one in Puerto Rico would learn that there were even Africans who were enslaved. I think what's kind of being lost right now is the purposeful terrorism that the United States government inflicted in all levels in Puerto Rico via assassinations, murders, incarceration, all the way to sterilization. So why I want to pinpoint that is, you cannot compare Puerto Rico and a census that is imposed on us. The United States Census does not allow for those people who would identify as Hispanic to pick a race. So why would Puerto Ricans pick being Black when it's not even an option? Why would Puerto Ricans, or let's say Dominican folks, quote, be anti-Black when they come to the United States? They're not anti-Black. The whole world is anti-Black. So when you have particularly Puerto Rican migration happening, these terms weren't being used. And I think that's a huge problem. Just like I think the word Latinx, Latino, have nothing to do with race, ethnicity, or politics, right? In fact, in my thesis at Cornell, when I was studying the Young Lords and spent a summer in Puerto Rico, up until 1880, if you were visibly negro, you had to carry a passbook, a libreta, much like the passbook system in South Africa, which confine you to certain parts of the island, right? So when you go to Puerto Rico, even now, The explosion of acceptance of Africanness and Blackness is everywhere. But we have to look at Louisa, which was purposely the community, the largest African descendant community, who that community itself began to not venture into the larger part of Puerto Rico because they knew that they would be facing racism, right? So I don't think you can put any kind of the way we talk about race now into the reality of Puerto Rico post Hurricane Maria, and as well as the ouster of Ricardo Rosa, and particularly like what Bad Bunny, Residente, and a lot of these newer, even white passing Puerto Ricans are acknowledging what they have not been taught. And post Hurricane Maria, look, before Hurricane Maria, let me just say this. Before Hurricane Maria, if you were an independista, this was the thing. They would say in Puerto Rico, tú eres independista. We're going to talk about that at the night. Why? Because if we even talk about it, we're going to be rounded up. And part of the
Rosa, I got to pause you. I got to take a break. I got to take a break, or else I might be independista without a job. Stay right here, everybody. On the other side of the break, a celebrity calls out a controversial tax on Puerto Rico, the century law that is still raising food prices on the island. Welcome back to theGrio. TV host Padma Lakshmi is calling out a ridiculous food tax in Puerto Rico. In her show, Taste the Nation, she called out the Jones Act, which is part of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. The act only allows ships that are owned and staffed by U.S. companies to transport items between ports in the country. Since Puerto Rico is not part of the mainland, foreign vessels have to stop in Florida and allow U.S. ships to carry items to Puerto Rico. As a result, Puerto Rico's grocery prices are 25% higher than on the mainland. All right, y'all. We're back with our guests for the hour, Danielle Clealand and Rosa Clemente. So I said Florida. My tongue was starting to do different things with the letters. Let's come back. I want to return to 2 points. The first point is about this independence movement. You all sort of gave an analysis. I want to know what y'all are comfortable with in terms of what the outcome should be. If someone says to you, Danielle Clealand, then I'm going to you, Rosa, what should Puerto Rico do? What's the best assessment based on all the history you know, all the knowledge you have, your analysis of the world? What's the best analysis, or rather the best outcome for Puerto Rico?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, it might not sound radical enough, but I don't really know what the answer is. I think that, being independent in the way that this world economy is set up, particularly for the Caribbean, making them rely on tourism to keep the economy stable, climate change and hurricanes, right? And everything that's happening, I'm scared of independence. And I'm not afraid to say that. I don't think that the current situation of being a colony, right, is ideal either, because, Puerto Ricans are without representation. They have to fight for the U.S. when they don't have the right to vote, right, in these elections. And then, with statehood, there's, a significant loss of, sovereignty and potential loss, right, of cultural autonomy. And so, to me, I've always, been very unsure about what, Puerto Rico's future should look like. And I know that I should have a more definitive answer than that, but I really don't.
No, look, it's complicated. I mean, and I always opt in the abstract for independence, right? Who wants to be part of an empire? But, as we saw with Haiti, they don't ever actually leave you alone. They starve you. They exploit you. They underdevelop you. They push you into a corner. So there's no, there's no harm in thinking through the kind of pragmatic sort of consequences of these choices. It's not for me to say what Puerto Rico should do. I'm just saying I get why it's complicated. Rosa, what do you think? What do you advocate for?
We're going to be free. I have no doubt about that. And after Hurricane Maria, this is what I was saying earlier. Before Hurricane Maria, people might have been afraid of being independent. But after Hurricane Maria, when the president comes and throws paper towels at you, and before that, the Black president, where we as Boricuas begged him, We begged Barack Obama not to sign Promesa. We begged people like Lin-Manuel and J-Lo and all these fake Boricuas who only bring
tell them what Promesa is. Tell the audience. Tell the audience what Promesa is.
Promesa was an oversight bill that was imposed. It's also called in part of La Junta, where basically it gave the power of the economy in Puerto Rico, and it put it in the hands of Wall Street bondholders, right? Like Detroit, right? So when we were begging all the Congress people, Nidia Velasquez, Jose Serrano, begged Barack Obama, begged Lin-Manuel, his father, they pushed Promesa through. With Promesa being pushed through, what ended up happening is the government had to go pay the debt. And the biggest thing in Puerto Rico is we don't owe the United States 1 cent. We will be independent. And then when we go to the United Nations, we will begin to file reparations claims for what the United States has extracted from us. And post Hurricane Maria, the consciousness shifted. It shifted. Puerto Ricans are no longer afraid of what we're going to do without the United States. We are doing it right now. And I'm so grateful to have watched that episode that Padma did in where she broke it down. Because in Puerto Rico, when we grow our food, it is taken from us and then sold back to us. But now with the independence fervor, the LGBTQIA, the trans community, people like me who will soon repatriate back to our island, we will be free. And anybody who doesn't think that doesn't understand the longevity of world history. We've been a colony for 125 years. That's a blip. We could be free for 1,000 and we will be free.
Hey, from your lips. Danielle, Clealand, let me ask you a question before you go. I asked you the kind of normative question, as we say. I asked you the kind of what should it be question. Now I want to ask you, though, what will it be? When you look at the immediate future of Puerto Rico in terms of, as Rosa mentioned, the outcome of natural disasters, the outcome of U.S. neglect, the outcome of kind of forced impoverishment. But on the other side, you see a vibrant resistance movement. You see a buoyant people, and you see so much possibility. What do you imagine for Puerto Rico in the next, say, 5 to 10 years in the last minute?
I mean, I imagine that there's, more resistance. I imagine that there's more frustration with, colonialism and the role of the United States. But I just, I don't know. I mean, maybe I need to be the pessimist in this in this segment, but I don't think the Caribbean will ever be free, right? Because the way that global capitalism works, nobody's free, right? And I don't think the United States will ever give anybody reparations, whether it be Black folks, whether it be Puerto Ricans. And so I think that, unless the entire structure of global capitalism is undone, then I don't see, right, a bright future for any Caribbean island or any small country or anyone in the global South, just because of the way that this whole system is set up, right? It's set up, for us to be poor, right, and for poverty to reign, and for anti-Blackness to reign, and so it's tough, I think, to really kind of look into the future and see kind of a positive trajectory.
Well, that wasn't the motivational speech I was looking for, but I don't bring brilliant scholars like Danielle and Rosa on to get us excited. I bring them on to give us the sober analysis of what the future is going to be. So, yeah, look, we're going to keep fighting, though. Look, Danielle, thanks for hanging out with me. Rosa, stick with me for another break. I want to get your take on your Afro-Boricua hero. Stay right here, everybody. We're on theGrio with Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome back to theGrio. We're back with community organizer, activist, and former Green Party vice presidential nominee, Rosa Clemente. Rosa, I got a minute, like a real legit minute here.
I got you.
But I want to know, who is your Afro-Boricua hero?
La Lupe, Dr. Maita Morena Vega, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. And as we celebrate 50 years of hip hop, let it be known and well respected that it was African-American, Puerto Ricans, and Jamaicans that started this culture. And as we celebrate that, it is this culture that really, for me, brought to light people like La Lupe, Dr. Vega, and Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. And listen, Big Pun might have been light and what all that looks like and never been to Puerto Rico, but he is so critically important because what he brought to us to hip hop was an affirmation of being a Boricua and a Morena and loving it. And he said it in 1990, and 30 years from now, you hear the song and everybody knows Boricua, Morena, and that's who we are.
That's it. By the way, Marta Moreno Vega was the head of El Museo del Barrio, right? Dr.
She
Vega.
created the Museo del
She was the head.
She created the Museo del
La Lupe,
Barrio, then the Caribbean Center, and then she now is in Puerto Rico in Luisa and has built 4 community centers.
Wow. Powerful names, important people. And on the other side of the break, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legendary Arturo Schomburg. But Rosa, I want to thank you for being amazing. Thank you for your activism. Thank you for your organizing. Thank you for your brilliant intellect. 15 years after your historic run, not to mention your commitment to the National Hip Hop Political Convention as an organizer, as a foundational figure. All right, family, we have reached the end of the show. But before I let you go, I want to give you my Afro-Boricua hero. We already heard about Roberto Clemente. We heard about Maria Vega. We heard about so many people tonight. And I want to add one more to the mix, although Rosa started to talk about him. And that is the great Arturo Schomburg. He is of Puerto Rican descent. He was born on the island, and he was taught in school that black people, African people, had no history. And so what did he do? He found our history. He went around collecting artifacts and books. He studied black people. And when he came to the United States, he taught Spanish in New York, but he kept collecting artifacts. And at some point, he had the greatest collection of African artifacts around. In fact, that when you go to the Schomburg Center in New York City, that is the work of the great Arturo Schomburg. He was self-taught. He was an autodidact, but he also trained some of the greatest minds of the 20th century, like the great John Henry Clark, who sat at his feet. He is a great man. He is one of the founders of our traditions in the 20th century, and he is a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, the Omicron chapter. That's Columbia University for you skaters out there that don't know.